Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Storyworks Roundtable. We have a transition to announce here today. Unfortunately, Matt Herron decided to leave us. Boo-hoo. He's going to focus on his fiction writing this year, and who can blame him? So we wish Matt the best of luck, and we are certainly going to miss him here on the Storyworks Roundtable. But I'm very excited to announce that Robert Scanlon is taking over Matt's position and joining us here. So, hey Robert, you are living in Australia. You write YA and science fiction, space opera, as well as other genres, correct? I don't want to miss a genre, so wonderful. Well, welcome aboard. We're really excited to have you with us. So today's episode, we are going to talk about setting, just in general terms. Robert, you just published a space opera. Do you want to give us some opening thoughts, maybe something about why you chose that particular setting for your story?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for inviting me onto the show. And big shoes to fill. Having followed the episodes with Matt, he's a very smart guy, very well informed, very well read, pulls up loads of great examples. So I'm sure I'm going to be under pressure to start.
Well, that's wonderful of you to say.
My own book to start with, so it'll make it a little easier to pull something up. Look, I think when it comes to setting, space opera in itself obviously has its own genre conventions, and the name comes from that whole idea of soap opera, and it was coined space opera because the idea was that it was episodic, kind of those same sort of things that you find in soap operas where people fight, there's inner conflicts, there's melodramatic scenarios, and that really is one of the essence of space opera. Some people sometimes unkindly call it just swords and sorcery in space, but probably if that's where you start when you think setting with it. I love science fiction, and I went back and I reread the entire Isaac Asimov Foundation series. I reread some Heinlein. I've been reading modern science fiction as well, and I realized that it was my first love for genre, and it still is. And so I wanted to go into an adult genre. I started with middle grade because at the time I was inspired by my daughter, who was, I think she was 9 at the time, so my protagonist was a 12-year-old girl, and that was a wonderful way to get going. And I started that in fantasy / sci-fi, but my real love is probably science fiction, less on the hard side of science fiction, where the setting is very engineering, mechanical, technically based, and I veer towards the other end of space opera, which is where it's very story and character driven, and for me it's more the pace and the events, but setting is important.
Right.
One of the things that
Sorry, I was just going to say I've noticed that about your book, that it is more character and action driven than technical, which I like personally. And I don't mean to cut you off, but after you say whatever you wanted to say, I'm just curious, you mentioned going back and reading some of the science fiction canon like Asimov. So I'm wondering what elements of setting you found in that canon that you were like, ooh, I really like that, I'm going to work with those elements, versus, oh, that's not so much, that's part of the genre I'm gonna kind of back away from or opt against.
Look, very quickly, I think it's what makes it science fiction is something that's a little bit out of the norm of our current life, but believable. And the same with fantasy, but with fantasy, it's kind of led by magic, and in science fiction it's going to be led by something you could believe to be science, even if it seems like magic, like lightsabers, for example. And that comes through even from the very early authors who popularized or made science fiction popular, I should say. So not the real classic like the Jules Verne, but the more modern Heinlein, Asimov, etc., is there was always something. You know, there was either some technology or something that had evolved from colonization or something, a little bit of a tweak. And that's what I liked, is that drove the sociological issues and the human issues. And I always really enjoyed that part. So that's what probably led me more to space opera, where you're really only using a little bit of science to drive the plot. And that's, I mean, although mine has the part of the plot is critical of the science, I could have done it without that, I believe anyway. But I think it's important to establish setting with things like high gravity or zero gravity, or, to let them know, okay, this is space we're talking about now, and not all planets you go to have Earth gravity. Yeah, if you watch almost any sci-fi on TV, you'll see that they almost always have Earth gravity because it's much easier to film.
Right. Well, actors have to walk. It would be a little difficult to act different gravities as people on Earth on a sound stage. Yeah. Now, okay, you mentioned some interesting things there. I love that you talk about gravity and how when you're world building, your setting, you've got to factor in these differences and have your characters interact with and react to these various elements of your world. So setting isn't just about, am I on a horse riding across a plain, or am I in a castle on a cliff, or am I, wherever. It's really so much more intricate than that. Kathryn, you write fantasy specifically. What would you like to say?
No, I agree. I think it's something that we're kind of narrowing in on here is like the details of setting can be really important and integral. So not just like you said, we're in a desert or we're on a mountain. Like those are your overarching like macro level setting things. But a lot of the micro things can affect so many more things. So you got to think little tiny bits that will then make the bigger difference than you even realize, like the gravity, or like the way that your magic system works affecting the climate, or affecting the way that things are built, or the way that all these different things that can change the way your characters interact with the world, which will then affect your story and your plot and your characters on multiple levels.
Absolutely. So okay, let's talk a little bit about the process of discovering these elements, the minutiae of setting, so to speak. When you were talking, Robert, I was thinking, well, is it science fiction if you set a story on a spaceship? Does that automatically make it science fiction? Because you could set any genre story in a house, right? And it could be sci-fi or fantasy or literary or romance or whatever. So does just having space, or for fantasy, say a medieval period, make it that thing? And I think you have to go beyond a sense of time and place to really get into those genres. So when you start writing and you say, okay, this is going to be set in a world that's not ours, at what point do you start drilling down? Kind of what's the process to get into those areas where the characters are interacting with and reacting to all these different things that are outside of our own realm of experience?
In the space opera genre, I think I personally was driven by what's going to be different for the reader. So the thing that when you're reading sci-fi like that, you can get quite entranced. Now, I don't over-describe things, and that's probably a criticism of my work, but I don't particularly like it either in sci-fi, although interesting, I like it in fantasy. So, Tolkien's rich descriptions I find wonderful. But in sci-fi, they bore me because they're like, no, I want to know about how the little gadget plugs in with this little tiny half twist into the zero-G generator thingy. It's I want to know what it does, So I think I like to think what's different here in this planet, and is that important to the story? Does it help drive the story? Does it add some richness to it? I try my best to think of setting as character as part of a contributing factor to what makes the story what it is. And I think in sci-fi, you've just got an open book there. So why not play with it? Why not say, hey, what could I have that's different here that adds difficulty for the main character, perhaps, or helps me lay some groundwork for a plot twist. So I think if we don't think about it doesn't matter if it's sci-fi or fantasy or literary. If you don't think about it, you miss some fabric of your story.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that you said that, and I think that's one of the key takeaways from this episode, is that when you think about what pieces of setting to include in your story, it has to be done in a way that's organic, so that it is part of the fabric of the story, and it is moving the plot forward or helping you develop a character, and it isn't just because it's cool,
Yeah.
In my critique group circle many years ago, we said you're showing your research when somebody was putting in some detail just because it was so cool, and they were like, oh, can you believe this thing I found out? And it stuck out of the story as like this appendage that just didn't really belong there,
Right.
And then you've got other authors who do that, and you can see in their reviews that some people dislike it. Have you read any of Neil Stephenson's work? So Cryptonomicon, Snow Crash, the latest one, Seven Eves, Reamder. There's speculative fiction in the sense that he's probably a techno thriller guy, but it is sci-fi. And the latest one, Seven Eves, is about what happens when something mysterious destroys the moon into 7 fragments, basically, and the Earth is going to be doomed within 2 years, and so they have to. 7 billion people are going to die, but some are going to survive because they're going to go up to the space station, and that's the story. But it's a survival story. But the setting is unbelievably detailed. I mean, I'm reading through, go, how did you find that out? About the International Space Station, or about the trajectory of rock fragments that fall from the moon, or I've done minor research into that sort of thing, and I loved it because it drove the story, and it was inherent to some of the plot points. I mean, they wouldn't have happened unless the science had gone that way. So the setting was absolutely key. And then when you read the reviews, there are a few people who say, he's just showing off his research and who he knows in NASA, and you go, please. Guy, it's 276,000 words. He's sweated over this.
Right, he did. That's Well, you can't please everybody, right? Some people are going to hate what you do, no matter what you do. But yeah, that just speaks more to the point of your setting and your research and all those elements needing to be integral to the story itself
and the readership. Who are you aiming it at? So, I deliberately chose not to aim mine at hard science readers because I know I'll fail them, because I just don't want that much detail, even though I'm a scientist by training. So I think, you've got to think about who you're writing for. A lot of people write for themselves. You write for yourself as I do. I want to write a book that I'd like to read.
Right.
So I suppose that drives setting to some degree.
Right. Did you guys read the... Oh, cripes. Tom Hanks was in the movie version of it like a few years ago. It was this book that it was like the writer was trying to do every genre within one book. So you read a short passage of this historical fiction, and then you jumped, well, not short passage, but kind of like a long short story or novella. Then you jumped to a different era, and then you jumped ahead. And you wound up going through all these time periods until you were in the future on like a space station or space colony or something. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I read that book.
Okay, I know we'll find the title and put it in the show notes, but
Cloud Atlas, right?
Cloud Atlas, thank you. Yes, Cloud Atlas. And I picked it up because everyone was talking about it, and I quit at the halfway mark because I was so frustrated with what he was trying to do and how I got really engaged in this one story, and then he left it, and I was like, what? Oh, okay. And then I got really engaged in this other story, and we went through all these different genres, and by the time I got to the science fiction, I was like, this is metafiction, this is an experiment, and I love intellectual stuff, I love meta stuff, I love puzzles, but I was like, screw this. This is not I'm not this guy's audience. And I think it raises a really valid point about writing to the correct audience, or writing your story and then finding the correct audience to market to, because not everyone is going to want to engage with every element of a specific genre or subgenre. Did you like Cloud Atlas, Kathryn?
So I fought my way through to the end of the book. I listened to it on audio, and I was sure that it was all going to wrap up neatly and nicely at the end, and it was going to make sense, and I was not satisfied.
Then I'm glad I dropped it.
But I don't know, like it's a very, like you said, it's an experimental book. But that being said, each of those worlds was very rich, and they did draw you in. He had some very intense settings in each of those places that you could really feel the way that they but I just didn't get how they all tied together.
Right. So, yeah, I agree. I think I was expecting more of an apparent through line and some sort of cohesion that would all make sense at the end. And I thought he was doing something with reincarnation, that like it was going to be the same character, in a way.
It goes all the way up through, and then it goes all the way
backwards.
And again, I didn't get it at the end, but I agree with you. I think it was mostly about reincarnation in some form. But yeah.
Yeah, I was shocked when the movie came out. I was like, really? Enough people liked this that they're making a movie?
I remember the movie. I think we got about 20 minutes through it and then just looked at each other and does this make any sense to you? Can you watch any more of this? And we're pretty generous, and I like quirky movies.
Yeah.
But, so having heard you talk about the book, you wonder, what inspired a film producer to think that was worth raising big money for.
Right.
Right. Well, now I feel like I'm in good company. I thought maybe I was, I don't know.
Trash that author. What was you saying? What was it you saying? You can't please everybody?
Right. Exactly.
Right. Yeah, but... we three, come on, we're the ones you want to please. Yes. All right. So in our few minutes remaining, let's talk a little bit about immersion in the setting. Because I was just working on a piece set in a medieval period, and I've written in the medieval period in the past. In fact, one of my master's theses was this medieval work. So I did really intensive research on the medieval period, and I thought, I'll just start writing and it's all going to come back to me, and it didn't. I was like, oh no, I have to go back to my books and research again. So what does researching look like for you two, or any thoughts on just the notion of immersion? How do you get immersed in your setting?
Right. I actually was struggling with this in a couple of my scenes that I was writing like about a month ago. I realized that I had a lot of overarching setting stuff, and I kind of knew like the architecture and the climate and a lot of the other like big building blocks of my settings. And I had to go back and check a couple more books out of the library just to start getting a few more little details to make it feel more real to the character walking through it, a little bit more about like clothing and a little bit more about food and maybe some of the flora fauna that I want to include, to be able to give it a little more depth,
right,
in order to make it feel more like you're living in this world rather than that it's just like a facade, like a set, piece behind the characters. I want the characters to be walking through it and dealing with the setting and not just...
You mean it's not that painted cloth on a wood frame wobbling behind them.
Not a green screen or anything like that, So, but that was interesting for me, is I thought I had done enough research, and I realized partway through that I needed just a few more little details in order to really feel tangible in certain places in my story. And it's not going to be like, oh, now I'm going to have to go back and change all this stuff. It's like just here and there touching a few things to kind of add some color, add some spice or flavor, or whichever I need to do in order to make it feel a little more real for the character.
Yeah, absolutely. Those key details are really critical to bringing a world to life, to adding that sense of verisimilitude. When I was writing my Victorian novel, Saving Annabelle, it spans 12 years, and my main character, my narrator, is female. So, of course, clothing and getting dressed is, not like jeans and a t-shirt. So I'd be writing a scene where they were going to put on a hat, or she was helping her mother get dressed, and, there are corsets and hoops and petticoats. And I'd be like, oh, crap, it's 1865 now. Have the hoops gone oval yet? Because my character would know, and this would be part of her everyday vocabulary. Right. So if I put it wrong in the text, 99% of my readers might not catch it, and it would be completely fine. But I want that one person who knows to be like, oh, she got it. Yeah, Right. So I get fixated on these details.
Yeah, and you don't want to be that author where, like, the person realizes halfway through the book that none of your characters have ever eaten, or gotten dressed, and done anything that is that little, even if it's just in passing, right? You're like, oh, these people don't actually live and breathe in their world, because there's none of that apparent.
Right, and I write that all the time in my notes. I was just writing that this morning, in fact, to a writer, that I'm like, okay, we had an overnight and a lot of really dramatic action with, like running and explosions and stuff. She's got to be starving by now. Like, get a Cliff Bar in this girl's hand or something. It is funny. I think as writers, we can kind of lose sight of the humanity of our characters because we're focusing on things like action and plot and suspense and, and setting. And you have to think, oh, what does she see? What does she smell? What does she taste? Is she hungry? Does she need? And all of that is part of the richness of that story.
Yeah, because it'd be silly to write a book called The Hunger Games, for example, and not have anything to do with food in there. And now you can buy recipe books based on the food from The Hunger Games.
Right.
So, and in fact, people who don't like it, I mean, I like it. I enjoyed the books apart from the ending of book 3, but that's irrelevant to the style and the setting. The setting is sensational. That's a good series of books to gain learning, I think, about setting. And they eat a lot. And she describes it a fair bit. And you think, oh, I wonder if that was a really deliberate, conscious choice.
Right.
Because, and like when you were talking about your medieval character, interesting things I think you can do with that sort of stuff, which you may have done, which is that they then think about, I hate these new blasted hoops, this new fashion that comes in. You can actually, that's what takes a reader, I think, present into the time, is when the character is dealing with the setting as if they are living it there and then, which I know you both said in the previous minutes, but I think that's important.
Right, it is.
It's not just there for the sake of it to say, I'm just showing you that this is we're in space because you can see stars, and then you forget about it forever. It's
right.
Make it work.
I'm glad you said that. I've talked about this example before, maybe even on this show, but when I was researching Saving Annabelle, I went to a living history farm and talked to all the reenactors and took notes, and because I'm weird and a writer. Yeah, they're like, people don't usually take notes. But this one household had the kitchen floorboards are like this wide and the parlor floorboards are this wide, because it was a symbol of status to have narrow floorboards, because it's more wood, it's more work to cut those boards small, more work to lay it in the house. So you put that in your parlor where you greet guests. And in the kitchen where nobody goes but the family or your servant, you've got big, basic wide floorboards. Yeah. And I thought that was so cool. And I was just like, how can I get this in the story? How can I show the reader that these floorboards are different? I don't know if I ever did, but it was that walking that tightrope between erring on the side of showing my research and, accomplishing that, making it a set piece where it's enriching to the story and to the characters' lives. And sometimes you just have to toss Toss your darlings. Say, oh, I can't use the floorboards. Yes. Damn.
That's true. That's well said. Because when they say kill your darlings, I mean, sometimes they talk about scenes or whatever, but that might also be setting, as you say. You know,
right?
So if you get this, because you can you get struck with an idea when I'm thinking about, I've got a scene, an idea for a scene, and for me it will come visually. It'll be a movie in my head. And so maybe part of that scene is, they're going to come out of this wormhole and see this extraordinary vista of surreal lights, and and it works great in my head. But you write it down after a couple of thousand words, it's really freaking boring. Right. Only so much description of bright lights that are surreal that you can do without something happening.
Right.
Right. Yes, exactly. Good point. All right, so we're going to wrap it up here. Any final thoughts on setting?
I would say be as deliberate with setting as you can with your characters, as you do with your plot. It's a part of how to bring readers into your story even more and make it rich.
Well said. Yes, be deliberate with your setting. Think of it as a character, as something that you make very careful choices about, that has to have richness and be part of the whole tapestry of the story, and not just, as we were saying, that wobbly backdrop that, no talking heads. And make sure your characters interact with your setting in real ways, just the way we move through our world. Whatever you build for them, they need to inhabit it and move through it. All right. Well, thank you so much for watching this episode of the Storyworks Roundtable. You can find this and other episodes at wordessential.com/storyworksroundtable. And while you're online, come join us at the Storyworks Writers Facebook group. Share your thoughts with us and all the other writers in the community.